Breaking news out of Sterling Heights, where police say a husband shot his wife in her work parking lot. That shooting happened at the Pomeroy Living Center on 15 Mile near DeQuinder. Gina Vici has an update on the victim's condition and the investigation.
A deacon stands in a hospital corridor, holding medical forms that will destroy everything he believes about his life. The doctor's words echo in his mind. This genetic condition couldn't have come from the father's side. In that moment, Deshaun Flood realizes the child he rushed to save isn't his. But this nightmare is just beginning. Within hours, DNA tests confirm his worst fears. Not one child, not two children. All three of the kids he's raised, loved, and sacrificed for over the past decade belong to other men. 10 years of marriage to Dominique. 10 years of being the devoted stay-at-home father while she built her career. 10 years of believing he was blessed with children despite his medical condition, making pregnancy nearly impossible. The betrayal cuts deeper than infidelity. This woman looked him in the eyes every single day, watched him bond with children that weren't his, and said nothing. She let him change diapers, attend parent-teacher conferences, and post proud father photos on Facebook, while knowing the devastating truth. But here's what makes this case absolutely chilling. Rumors are swirling that the real fathers aren't strangers. They're his own family members. 11 days before Dominique would be fighting for her life in a hospital parking lot, Deshaun checked himself into a psychiatric facility. His mind was fracturing under the weight of this betrayal. The doctors recommended immediate transfer to a specialized facility in Chicago. Instead, they released him. 11 days later, over 20 gunshots would echo through a senior living center parking lot in Sterling Heights. What happened during those 11 crucial days? How did a man of God become a would-be killer? And why are thousands of people online saying Dominique got exactly what she deserved? But what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about betrayal, mental health, and justice. Here's what separates my channel from every other true crime creator. I don't just tell you what happened. I show you the psychological patterns that could save your life or someone you love. Most viewers think they can spot these warning signs, but the statistics prove otherwise. If you're confident you can recognize when someone is about to snap, hit subscribe and prove it in the comments. If you're not subscribing, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me what's stopping you. Are you afraid of what you might learn about yourself? To understand how devastating this betrayal truly was, you need to see the life Deshaun Flood built with Dominique. On the surface, they were the picture-perfect couple that everyone admired. He wasn't just any husband. He was Doc to his community, a respected deacon and preacher who put God at the center of everything he did. His Facebook profile told the story of a devoted family man, with his banner photo proudly displaying the 3 children he believed were his legacy. For over 10 years, Deshaun had structured his entire existence around his family, while Dominique pursued her education and built her career at the rehabilitation center. He became the stay-at-home father who made it all possible. He cooked the meals, attended every school event, helped with homework, and created the stable home environment that allowed his wife to thrive professionally. This wasn't a man who was absent or neglectful. He was hyper-involved in every aspect of his children's lives. But there's a medical detail that makes this betrayal even more sinister. As a young man, Deshaun contracted meningitis, a devastating illness that affected his spine and left him with lifelong consequences. The doctors told him the brutal truth. His chances of fathering children were extremely low. When Dominique became pregnant with their first child, Deshaun saw it as nothing short of a miracle from God. Each subsequent pregnancy felt like another divine blessing, proof that his faith and devotion were being rewarded. Imagine the psychological impact of believing you've been blessed with miracle children, only to discover they were never yours at all. Every diaper change, every sleepless night, every proud moment of school play, all of it was built on a foundation of lies. Deshaun didn't just lose his children that day in the hospital. He lost his identity as a father, his faith in divine providence, and his belief in the woman he devoted his life to. The cruelest part? Dominique watched him struggle with his medical condition, saw him thank God for the miracle of each pregnancy, and never said a word. She let him believe he was experiencing divine intervention while she was actually experiencing something far more earthly with other men. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in being a godly husband and father, this wasn't just infidelity. It was the complete destruction of everything he thought he knew about himself and his purpose in life. This is the foundation that would crumble in 11 devastating days, leading to a morning in July that would change both their lives forever. But the medical revelation was just the beginning of Deshawn's psychological unraveling. The morning that destroyed Deshawn Flood's world started like any other day of devoted fatherhood. One of his children had fallen ill with symptoms that seemed familiar, the kind of genetic condition that doctors said could be passed down through family lines. As a responsible father, Deshawn didn't hesitate. He scooped up his sick child and rushed to the hospital, ready to do whatever it took to get help. But this wasn't going to be a routine medical visit. As Deshawn sat in the sterile hospital room, watching doctors examine his child, the questions began. Medical history forms, genetic screening questions, family health background inquiries. The doctors needed to understand the hereditary factors that might be causing the illness. They asked about conditions that ran in Deshawn's family, specifically looking for genetic markers that would have been passed from father to child. That's when the impossible became undeniable. The medical professionals, armed with genetic testing and family history analysis, delivered news that shattered Deshawn's reality. The condition affecting his child couldn't have come from the paternal side. In fact, the genetic markers they were seeing were completely inconsistent with Deshawn being the biological father. The child he'd rushed to save, the child he'd stayed up countless nights worrying about, wasn't genetically his. The hospital room must have felt like it was spinning as the implications crashed over him. If this child wasn't his, what about the other two? The questions that had been buried in the back of his mind for years suddenly demanded answers. Those moments when people said the kids didn't look like him. The times when family members made offhand comments about resemblance. The nagging doubts he'd pushed away because he trusted his wife completely. Within days, DNA tests confirmed his worst nightmare. Not just one child, but all three. A decade of fatherhood erased in a single moment of scientific certainty. The children who called him daddy, who ran to him when they were scared, who he'd planned college funds for. None of them carried his DNA. Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every proud moment he'd shared on social media was built on a lie so massive it defied comprehension. But the psychological devastation went deeper than just paternity fraud. Remember, Deshawn's meningitis had left him believing he was nearly infertile.
Yeah, this is still a very active scene behind me. Take a look at this. Look at the bullet casing markings on the ground here. Sterling Heights police saying around 8 o'clock this morning they received a 911 call that a woman had been shot in the parking lot here at the Pomeroy Living Center off of 15 Mile near DeQuinder. We're told an employee was shot by her husband in the parking lot. We're told they both lived in the city of Warren and that the husband came up to his wife's employer and shot her several times. Police thankfully were able to respond to the scene within seconds. The wife was rushed to a nearby hospital where she is still alive.
When Dominique became pregnant the first time, he saw it as divine intervention. The second pregnancy felt like another miracle. By the third, he was convinced God was blessing their faithful marriage with abundant children despite his medical limitations. The cruel irony? His medical condition was probably accurate. He likely couldn't father children easily. Dominique's pregnancies weren't miracles. They were evidence of her ongoing betrayal. The man who had built his identity around being a blessed father and devoted husband was forced to confront a reality that destroyed both foundations simultaneously. His existing mental health struggles, including seizures and psychological issues stemming from his childhood meningitis, were now compounded by trauma so severe it would break most people. The devoted deacon who had always turned to faith in times of trouble found himself questioning everything he believed about God, marriage, and his own worth. This is when Deshawn Flood made the decision that would define the final chapter of his story. Recognizing that his mind was fracturing under the weight of this revelation, he did something that showed remarkable self-awareness. He checked himself into a psychiatric facility, desperately seeking help before he completely lost control. On July 18, 2025, Deshawn Flood made a decision that should have saved 2 lives. Recognizing that his mind was spiraling into dangerous territory, he voluntarily admitted himself to a mental health facility. This wasn't a man in denial about his psychological state. This was someone desperately trying to get help before he did something irreversible. For a brief moment, it seemed like the mental health system might actually work the way it's supposed to. The intake process revealed the full scope of Deshawn's deteriorating condition. His seizures, a lingering consequence of the childhood meningitis that had already stolen so much from him, were becoming more frequent and severe. The psychological trauma of discovering his entire family life was built on lies had triggered a mental health crisis that even trained professionals could see was dangerous. He wasn't just depressed or angry. He was experiencing a complete psychological break from reality. After evaluating his condition, the mental health professionals made a critical recommendation. Deshawn needed specialized care at a more advanced facility in Chicago, one better equipped to handle the complex intersection of his neurological issues and acute psychological trauma. This wasn't a casual suggestion. It was an urgent medical recommendation from professionals who understood the severity of his condition. They could see what was coming if he didn't get proper treatment. But here's where the system failed catastrophically. Instead of following through with the transfer to Chicago, instead of keeping him under observation until he could be properly stabilized, they released him. 11 days before he would turn a parking lot into a crime scene, mental health professionals sent Deshawn Flood back into the world with his trauma unresolved and his rage building to a breaking point. What happened during those 11 days remains largely a mystery, but we can piece together fragments from his family's later statements. According to the GoFundMe page his grandmother would eventually create, Deshawn was still putting God first, even as his world collapsed around him. He was trying to maintain his faith, trying to find meaning in the devastation, trying to be the man of God he'd always been. But faith and fury were waging war in his mind, and faith was losing. Think about the psychological torture of those 11 days. Every morning, he woke up to the same devastating reality. Every time he saw those children, he was reminded that they weren't his. Every time he looked at Dominique, he saw the woman who had orchestrated the most elaborate deception imaginable. The woman he'd supported through school. The woman he'd sacrificed his own ambitions for. The woman he'd trusted with his heart and his future. She had been living a double life for over a decade. The religious man in him knew that violence was wrong, that vengeance belonged to God. But the broken human being in him was drowning in a rage so pure and consuming that it threatened to obliterate everything else. His seizures were getting worse, his mental state was deteriorating, and the specialized help he desperately needed was hundreds of miles away in Chicago. On July 29th, the 11-day countdown would reach zero, and Deshawn Flood would make a decision that would destroy what remained of both their lives. 8 o'clock in the morning on July 29th, 2025. While most people were starting their Tuesday with coffee and morning routines, Deshawn Flood was already in position at the Pomeroy Living Center on 15 Mile Road, near Dequindre in Sterling Heights. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. This was a calculated plan executed with chilling precision. He had arrived early, before Dominique's shift began, and positioned himself in the parking lot where he knew she would have to walk. The waiting must have been excruciating. Sitting in his car, watching other employees arrive for their shifts, knowing that any moment his wife would pull into this parking lot and his life would change forever. Did he have second thoughts during those minutes? Did the deacon in him whisper prayers for strength to walk away? We'll never know what went through his mind as he waited, but we know he didn't leave. When Dominique's car finally appeared, the 11 days of psychological torture crystallized into action. She stepped out of her vehicle, probably thinking about her workday ahead, completely unaware that her husband was watching from across the parking lot. But something must have alerted her to danger. Maybe she saw his car. Maybe she caught a glimpse of him moving toward her. Her survival instincts kicked in immediately. Dominique ran, not toward the building where her co-workers could help, but toward the nearest vehicle, a co-worker's car that was unlocked. She dove inside, probably screaming for help, trying to pull the door closed behind her. For a split second, it might have seemed like she'd found safety, but Deshawn was already there, his hand stopping the door from closing, trapping her inside the vehicle with nowhere to run. This is when the rage that had been building for 11 days exploded into violence. Deshawn pulled out a revolver and began firing. Not one shot, not two shots, but multiple rounds fired at point-blank range into the car where his wife was trapped. The sound of gunshots echoed across the parking lot of a senior living facility, terrorizing elderly residents and staff members who had never expected to witness such brutality. But Dominique wasn't finished fighting for her life. Somehow, despite being shot multiple times, she and her co-worker managed to escape through the driver's side door. They ran toward the building, probably screaming for help, leaving a trail of blood behind them. Other employees inside the facility were calling 911, but Deshaun wasn't done. His wife was still alive, still moving, and his mission wasn't complete. He caught up to Dominique before she could reach safety. This is when the shooting turned into something even more personal and vicious. Deshaun began pistol whipping her in the head, using his revolver as a blunt weapon to inflict maximum damage. The woman who had deceived him for over a decade was now at his mercy, and mercy was the last thing on his mind. Each blow to her head was 11 days of psychological torture being released in the most violent way possible. The entire attack lasted only minutes, but those minutes contained over 20 gunshots, according to the evidence markers police would later place throughout the parking lot. 20 shots fired by a man who had completely lost control, who had crossed the line from victim to perpetrator in the most devastating way possible. The parking lot looked like a war zone, with bullet casings scattered across the asphalt and blood marking the path of Dominique's desperate attempt to escape. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Police sirens were approaching, and reality crashed back into Deshaun's consciousness. The deacon who had tried to get help 11 days earlier was gone, replaced by a man who had just attempted to murder his wife in broad daylight. When officers arrived, they found him still at the scene, the revolver still in his possession, and Dominique clinging to life, despite multiple gunshot wounds. The 11-day countdown had reached its inevitable conclusion, but somehow, miraculously, Dominique had survived. The question now was whether either of their lives could ever be salvaged from the wreckage of that morning. Within minutes of the shooting, Dominique Flood was rushed to a nearby hospital with multiple gunshot wounds that should have killed her. The fact that she survived over 20 shots fired at close range seemed impossible to everyone involved, including the paramedics who worked frantically to keep her alive during transport. Doctors would later describe her survival as nothing short of miraculous, though the physical and psychological scars would last forever. Meanwhile, Deshaun was taken into custody without further incident. The man who had just unleashed 11 days of rage in a parking lot offered no resistance to police. His mugshot, released days later, told its own story. His face was battered and swollen, suggesting that either Dominique had fought back harder than anyone realized, or the police had to use significant force to subdue him. The deacon who had once preached about peace and forgiveness looked like he'd been through a war. The legal consequences came swift and severe. Deshaun was charged with 2 counts of assault with intent to murder, 1 count of possession of a firearm by a prohibited person, and 3 counts of felony firearm. His bond was set at $1 million cash surety, an amount that essentially guaranteed he would remain behind bars while awaiting trial. If convicted on the assault charges alone, he faced up to life in prison. But then something unprecedented happened in the court of public opinion. As news of the case spread across social media, the typical narrative of domestic violence began to fracture in ways that shocked even seasoned observers. Instead of universal condemnation for Deshaun's actions, a significant portion of the public began expressing understanding, even support, for what he had done. Comment sections filled with people saying Dominique got what she deserved, and that Deshaun was the real victim in this situation. Most shocking of all was the reaction from women online. Traditionally, domestic violence cases see women rallying to support the female victim regardless of circumstances. But in this case, thousands of women were openly stating that they understood Deshaun's actions, that paternity fraud was a form of abuse that justified his response, and that Dominique had brought this violence upon herself through her decade of deception. The gender lines that usually define public reaction to domestic violence had completely dissolved. The support wasn't just emotional, it was financial. Deshaun's grandmother created a GoFundMe page to raise money for his legal defense, and donations began pouring in from strangers across the country. The fundraising page revealed additional details that made his story even more sympathetic to supporters. It confirmed that he had been the stay-at-home father who sacrificed his own ambitions to support Dominique's career and education. It detailed his ongoing health struggles with seizures and mental health issues stemming from childhood meningitis. Most importantly, it verified what many had suspected, that his medical condition made the miracle of having 3 children seem like divine intervention. Social media exploded with debates about accountability, betrayal, and justice. Hashtag supporting Deshaun began trending, with people sharing their own stories of paternity fraud and relationship deception. Others pushed back, arguing that no amount of betrayal justified attempted murder, and that Deshaun's supporters were essentially endorsing domestic violence. The case had touched a nerve in American society about gender, relationships, and accountability that went far deeper than typical true crime stories. Adding fuel to the fire were unverified rumors circulating on social media that the real fathers of Dominique's children weren't random strangers, but members of Deshaun's own family. While these claims couldn't be substantiated and weren't part of the official charges, they spread like wildfire online, adding another layer of betrayal to an already devastating story. The public reaction revealed something uncomfortable about American society, that there are forms of betrayal so profound that they can shift public sympathy even in cases of extreme violence. Deshaun Flood had become an unlikely symbol for men who felt victimized by deceptive partners, while Dominique had become a cautionary tale about the potential consequences of relationship fraud. While news outlets focused on the dramatic shooting and legal proceedings, they completely missed the deeper psychological and societal forces that made this case a powder keg waiting to explode. This wasn't just another domestic violence incident. It was a perfect storm of systemic failures, psychological trauma, and cultural tensions that reveal uncomfortable truths about modern relationships and mental health care. The first critical failure was in the mental health system itself. When Deshaun voluntarily admitted himself on July 18th, he was essentially waving a red flag and begging for help. Mental health professionals recognized his condition was severe enough to warrant transfer to a specialized facility in Chicago, yet they released him anyway. This represents a catastrophic breakdown in the very system designed to prevent exactly this type of tragedy. How many other potential perpetrators are walking free right now because facilities lack the resources or legal authority to provide adequate care? But the mental health failure goes deeper than just inadequate treatment. Deshaun's case highlights a blind spot in how we understand and treat trauma related to paternity fraud. While therapists are trained to handle infidelity, divorce, and even physical abuse, there's virtually no established protocol for helping men process the discovery that their children aren't biologically theirs. The psychological impact of this specific betrayal is so devastating that it deserves its own category of trauma treatment. Yet most mental health professionals are completely unprepared to address it. The medical community also bears responsibility for this tragedy. When Deshaun brought his child to the hospital, medical professionals had genetic information that revealed the paternity issue. But there's no standard protocol for how to handle such discoveries. Should doctors be required to inform patients when genetic testing reveals non-paternity? Should there be counseling resources immediately available? The medical system stumbled into revealing life-altering information without any support structure in place to help Deshaun process it. From a legal perspective, this case exposes a massive gap in how our justice system handles paternity fraud. While Deshaun faces life in prison for his violent response, Dominique faces no legal consequences whatsoever for a decade of deception that destroyed multiple lives. In most states, paternity fraud isn't even a crime, despite causing psychological damage that can be as severe as physical abuse. The legal system essentially tells men that being deceived about paternity is their problem to handle, while simultaneously criminalizing any response that goes beyond quiet acceptance. The sociological implications are equally disturbing. The widespread public support for Deshaun reveals a deep cultural resentment about gender dynamics in modern relationships. Many men feel that women face no accountability for relationship deception, while men are expected to accept any betrayal without complaint. This case became a lightning rod for those frustrations, with Deshaun serving as an unlikely martyr for men who feel victimized by a system they perceive as biased against them. The religious dimension adds another layer of complexity that most analysts ignored. Deshaun wasn't just any husband. He was a deacon whose entire identity was built around Christian values of faithfulness, forgiveness, and family. The cognitive dissonance between his religious beliefs and his desire for revenge created a psychological pressure cooker that his already compromised mental state couldn't handle. His faith told him to forgive, but his humanity demanded justice that would never come through legal channels. Perhaps most troubling is what this case reveals about the prevalence of paternity fraud in American society. While exact statistics are difficult to obtain, studies suggest that between 2 and 10% of children are not biologically related to their presumed fathers. This means millions of American men may be unknowingly raising children that aren't theirs, and millions of women are living with the secret knowledge of their deception. Deshaun's case isn't an isolated incident. It's a window into a hidden epidemic that destroys families every day. The technology factor cannot be ignored either. Advances in genetic testing and DNA analysis are making paternity fraud increasingly difficult to hide. As these tests become more common and affordable, we can expect to see more cases like Deshaun's emerging. Society needs to prepare for this reality by developing better support systems, legal frameworks, and therapeutic approaches to handle these revelations. What makes this case particularly tragic is how preventable it was at multiple points. If the mental health system had kept Deshaun in treatment, if there were legal consequences for paternity fraud that might have deterred Dominique's deception, if there were established protocols for handling genetic discoveries in medical settings, if there were better support systems for men dealing with this specific type of betrayal, any of these interventions might have prevented the violence that erupted on July 29th. Instead, we're left with a case that exposes the fault lines in our society's approach to relationships, mental health, and justice. Deshaun Flood's story isn't just about one man's violent breakdown. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when multiple systems fail simultaneously, leaving individuals to handle devastating trauma without adequate support or recourse. The wheels of justice began turning immediately after Deshaun's arrest, but the legal proceedings would reveal just how complex this case truly was. Macomb County Prosecutor Peter Lucido wasted no time in filing the most serious charges possible, making it clear that the prosecution intended to seek maximum penalties regardless of the circumstances that led to the shooting. His public statement was unambiguous. We will prosecute this case vigorously and pursue full accountability through the justice system. Deshaun was arraigned on July 31st before Magistrate Gene Cloud in the 41st State District Court in Sterling Heights. The charges were devastating in their scope and potential consequences. 2 counts of assault with intent to murder carried the possibility of life imprisonment, while the weapons charges added additional years to any potential sentence. The prosecution's message was clear. Whatever sympathy the public might have for Deshaun's situation, the legal system would show no mercy for his actions. The $1 million cash surety bond effectively guaranteed that Deshaun would remain behind bars throughout the legal proceedings. Even if supporters managed to raise substantial funds through the GoFundMe campaign, the cash requirement meant that the full amount would need to be available up front, not just the typical 10% used by bail bondsmen. The conditions attached to any potential release were equally restrictive: GPS monitoring and absolutely no contact with the victims. Deshaun's legal representation fell to attorney Robin Kennedy, who faced the challenging task of defending a client whose actions were captured on security cameras and witnessed by multiple people. Kennedy's strategy would likely focus on mental health defenses, arguing that Deshaun's psychological state at the time of the shooting was so compromised that he couldn't form the intent necessary for attempted murder charges. The 11-day gap between his release from the mental health facility and the shooting would be crucial evidence in establishing his deteriorating mental condition. The court schedule moved forward with mechanical precision despite the emotional complexity of the case. The probable cause conference was initially set for August 7th, with the preliminary examination scheduled for August 14th before Judge Anne-Marie Lepore. These hearings would determine whether there was sufficient evidence to bind the case over for trial, though given the overwhelming evidence of the shooting itself, The real battle would be over the degree of charges and potential defenses. Behind the scenes, both sides were preparing for a legal battle that would likely hinge on psychiatric evaluations and expert testimony about Deshawn's mental state. The prosecution would argue that his actions were premeditated and calculated, evidenced by his early arrival at Dominique's workplace and the systematic nature of the attack. The defense would counter that his mental health issues, combined with the devastating psychological trauma of discovering the paternity fraud, rendered him incapable of forming criminal intent. The case had already attracted significant media attention, and jury selection would prove challenging given the polarized public opinion surrounding the circumstances. The legal proceedings promised to be as explosive as the crime itself, with fundamental questions about justice, accountability, and mental health hanging in the balance. The Deshawn Flood case serves as a devastating blueprint for how multiple system failures can converge to create an entirely preventable tragedy. Every aspect of this case, from the initial betrayal to the final violent confrontation, represents a missed opportunity for intervention that could have saved both lives from destruction. The most glaring failure was in mental health crisis intervention. When someone voluntarily admits themselves to a psychiatric facility and professionals recommend specialized treatment, that recommendation should be treated as a medical emergency, not a suggestion. Deshawn literally asked for help and was denied the level of care that might have prevented his breakdown. Mental health facilities need mandatory protocols for high-risk patients, including extended holds and mandatory transfers when specialized care is recommended. The 11-day gap between his release and the shooting represents 11 days when proper treatment could have changed everything. Healthcare providers also need established protocols for handling genetic discoveries that reveal paternity issues. When medical testing uncovers non-paternity, there should be immediate counseling resources available and clear guidelines for how to communicate such devastating information. Doctors shouldn't be left to improvise when delivering news that can destroy families and trigger psychological crises. The legal system must address the glaring inconsistency in how it handles relationship fraud versus violent responses to that fraud. While no one should resort to violence, the complete absence of legal consequences for paternity fraud creates a system where victims feel they have no recourse except taking matters into their own hands. States need legislation that recognizes paternity fraud as a form of abuse with real legal consequences, including financial restitution for men who have been deceived into supporting children that aren't theirs. Educational initiatives are equally crucial. Relationship counselors, religious leaders, and family therapists need specialized training in recognizing and addressing the unique psychological trauma associated with paternity fraud. The warning signs that preceded Deshawn's breakdown, increasing seizures, religious crisis, social withdrawal, and voluntary psychiatric admission, should have triggered immediate intervention protocols. Most importantly, society needs honest conversations about accountability in relationships. While violence is never acceptable, the widespread public support for Deshawn reveals a deep frustration with the lack of consequences for relationship deception. Creating legal and social frameworks that hold people accountable for major betrayals might prevent some individuals from feeling that violence is their only option for justice. Prevention also requires recognizing that paternity fraud isn't a victimless crime. The psychological damage it causes can be as severe as physical abuse, and treating it as such might encourage earlier intervention and support for victims before they reach their breaking point. Deshawn's story didn't have to end in a parking lot shooting. It could have ended with proper mental health care, legal recourse, and social support systems that actually worked. The Deshawn Flood case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about betrayal, mental health, and the limits of human endurance. This wasn't a story about a monster who suddenly snapped. It was about a devoted father and husband whose world was systematically destroyed by the person he trusted most. The 11 days between his psychiatric facility release and the shooting represent a countdown that didn't have to reach zero. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the violence that erupted in that parking lot, but how preventable it all was. Every system that should have protected both Deshawn and Dominique failed catastrophically. The mental health system released a man they knew was dangerous. The legal system offered no recourse for a decade of deception. The medical system stumbled into revealing life-destroying information without support structures in place. As this case moves through the courts, we'll continue following every development, every legal maneuver, and every revelation that emerges. The trial promises to be as explosive as the crime itself, with fundamental questions about justice, accountability, and mental health hanging in the balance. But the real question isn't what will happen to Deshaun Flood. It's whether we'll learn anything from this tragedy to prevent the next one. This case exposes the uncomfortable reality that betrayal, mental health crises, and violence intersect in ways most people refuse to acknowledge. While you were watching this, 3 more cases like Deshaun's probably started developing somewhere in America. My subscribers get exclusive access to my Psychological Breakdown series that reveals the warning signs everyone else misses, the same patterns that could help you protect yourself or someone you love. If you're serious about understanding these dark truths and potentially preventing the next tragedy, subscribe now and join the community that isn't afraid to face reality. But if you're not ready for that level of uncomfortable truth, I respect that. Drop a comment and tell me honestly what's holding you back. Is it fear, denial, or do you genuinely believe you already know everything you need to know about human nature? I'm curious about your reasoning.